Welcome as we reveal some of the most heartbreaking and horrifying real-life tales of treachery and criminality. This episode reveals a horrifying tale of ruthless retaliation, treachery, and brutality. After viciously beating his step-grandmother, a grandson infects her with HIV, starting a series of events that would result in horrifying retaliation. Come along as we examine the terrifying specifics of this disturbing case and her subsequent actions that left everyone in shock. Throughout his life, Stephen Brickell faced challenges that many would consider insurmountable. Stephen had to mature fast because he was born into a family that struggled with addiction. Janice, his mother, had spent years struggling with substance abuse and alcoholism. When Stephen was just 10 years old, her problems finally resulted in her being arrested for driving under the influence and sent to prison. Stephen was placed with his step-grandmother, Laurie Brickell, and her husband, Dean, because no one else could take care of him. Stephen encountered many difficulties in their small Milton, Georgia house. Laurie, a former English teacher at a high school, put a lot of effort into keeping up the impression of a normal family life. Laurie was left to do the most of the household duties because Dean, a once prosperous businessman, was experiencing the early stages of dementia and strokes. Stephen had a turbulent adolescence. He struggled in school, frequently fighting with teachers and skipping lessons, despite Laurie's best efforts. He had completely dropped out by the time he was 15. Without the routine of school, Stephen started hanging out with the wrong crowd, tried drugs, and eventually fell into an addiction. He was homeless by the age of 18, spending the night on the streets or in shelters. Although he occasionally received food and short-term housing from neighborhood nonprofits like the Atlanta Mission, Stephen found it difficult to establish a steady routine. Laurie persuaded Stephen to go back home at the beginning of 2011 by offering to assist him in starting over. Things appeared to get better for a time. Inspired by his late father's love of automobiles, Stephen started talking about plans to get his GED and his desire of becoming a mechanic. In the hopes of one day restoring it, he even spent weekends tinkering with an old Honda Civic. But that summer, their relationship took a bad turn. The extraordinarily strong friendship between Laurie and Stephen finally turned into a sexual one. Even though Stephen didn't talk about it much, people who knew him well saw a big shift in his conduct. He'd become more reclusive and prone to angry outbursts. Arguments between Stephen and Laurie were frequent as tensions at home increased. Laurie told a friend that she had begun to be physically abused by Stephen. On occasion, neighbors heard real conflicts, with Stephen storming out of the house and Laurie yelling. Laurie, who was in her late 60s, could not compete with Stephen, who was 19 years old and physically intimidating at over 6 feet. Nevertheless, rather than being motivated by pure malice, Stephen's aggression appeared to be motivated by bewilderment and remorse. Stephen seemed distressed in the days before his death. According to friends, he appeared upset and made cryptic statements about having to leave the residence. The embarrassment of their connection and Stephen's mounting guilt over his behavior seemed to be weighing him down, something that, unfortunately, would end in his murder. On October 12, 2011, on a cool fall morning, Laurie Brickell called Milton police in a panic. According to the 68-year-old retiree Stephen Brickell, her step-grandson was not responding in his bedroom. He rarely skipped breakfast, so she said she had gone to see how he was doing after he didn't show up. Laurie was standing in the driveway, clearly startled when police arrived at the Brickell residence in a peaceful cul-de-sac in the suburban area. Neighbors said she was not wearing her typical polished appearance, but rather a housecoat and slippers. In his report, one of the first responders, Officer James Delaney, detailed the situation. He wrote that although Lori was crying, she appeared strangely calm. "I don't understand how this happened," she repeated. The body of Stephen was discovered in his tiny bedroom in the rear of the house. Clothes, a disassembled Honda Civic engine, and posters of vintage vehicles and rock groups like Led Zeppelin littered the room. Officers found him curled against the wall in his twin bed. Stephen was on his back, with a dry cleaning bag over his face and no pants on. Suffocation was suggested by the way the bag's edges were knotted tightly around his neck. There were bruises on his arms and hands, probably from a fight. There was a half-empty bottle of Clorox on the floor next to the bed, and the room had a strong bleach odor. But detectives suspected that someone had attempted to clean up the scene, since they noticed right away that the bleach didn't seem to belong there. Officers were informed by Lori that she hadn't seen Steve since the night before. He had slammed his door and gone to bed early since he was in a terrible temper. She said she heard nothing out of the ordinary during the night. Within an hour, a group of forensic investigators showed there and started recording the scene. They took samples from different places, gathered the plastic bag, and swabbed the bleach bottle for fingerprints. Neighbors, startled by the disturbance, started to congregate outdoors. Since the Brickells were a somewhat quiet family, word of Stephen's passing spread swiftly around the neighborhood. A shattered household and an unsolved mystery remained after Stephen's body was taken to the Fulton County Medical Examiner's office for an autopsy. They soon discovered that Stephen Brickell's death was not an accident when they arrived at his home on October 12, 2011. Under the direction of Detective Carla Monroe, forensic investigators started closely examining the scene. A 15-year veteran of the Milton Police Department, Monroe was well known in the community for her attractive physique, as well as her keen intuition and meticulous style. The little disorganized bedroom was shut off right away. After noticing the overpowering bleach odor, investigators started gathering samples from the furniture, walls, and floor. After being discovered coiled around Stephen's neck, a plastic dry cleaning bag was taken out and forwarded to the crime lab of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, for analysis. As part of Stephen's autopsy, forensic specialists collected evidence and performed a standard blood panel. A startling detail is revealed by the results. Stephen had HIV. According to his medical records, he had not sought treatment, indicating that he had probably kept his status a secret from others. The finding gave the inquiry a concerning new dimension. HIV was manageable, but it required open communication and medical attention, which Stephen had not done, according to public health campaigns that were in effect at the time. Investigators wondered how long Stephen had been aware of his HIV status and whether it had affected his behavior. Stephen may have contracted the virus while performing street acts. When forensic technicians returned to the scene, they found injuries on Stephen's arms, wrists, and chest, which suggested a violent altercation before to his passing. Partial fingerprints were discovered on the bleach container next to the bed, and a damaged lamp on the nightstand indicated a fight. In the hopes that it would identify a suspect, investigators also swabbed the bag for DNA evidence. The group, led by Detective Monroe, started assembling a chronology of the previous evening. According to Lord Brickhill, she didn't see why someone would wish to hurt him. Monroe pointed up contradictions in her comments, though, especially with her most recent interaction with Stephen. The following day, the troubled 19-year-old's unexplained death was covered by media publications such as the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The piece presented a somber image of a young guy attempting to start over by highlighting Stephen's battles with addiction and homelessness. New issues were raised when Stephen's HIV status was revealed. Was there anyone in the Brickell home aware of it? And if so, may it have served as a reason for killing someone? The focus of the investigation soon shifted to Stephen's 68-year-old step-grandmother, Lorraine Laurie Brickell. Since Stephen's mother, Janice, called him and was imprisoned for DUI when he was just 12, Laurie had been his primary caregiver. In Milton, Georgia, Laurie, a former high school English teacher, was highly respected for her polished manner and her contributions to local organizations. However, she and Stephen did not have a cordial relationship behind closed doors. Laurie used tense yet responsible language to explain her position as a carer. In an attempt to prevent Stephen from slipping further into the turmoil of his early years, she had intervened to give him a secure environment. But Stephen battles addiction and frequently encounters the law, wore on Laurie over the years. Stephen was taller than Laurie, standing 6 feet tall and weighing over 200 pounds. Their intense disagreements, some of which turned physical, were frequently overheard by their neighbors. During interrogation, Laurie acknowledged that Stephen had become more violent and frequently pushed or grabbed her during altercations. She told Detective Carla Monroe that he was uncontrollable. "He would hit me regardless of what I did." Laurie initially introduced herself as a worried grandma who had just found Stephen's body. Hours of questioning, however, caused her well-preserved facade to crumble. She was questioned by detectives about the contradictions in her tale, particularly in her description of what happened before Stephen died. Laurie paused when questioned about her relationship with Stephen. Her body language became stiff, as if she had practiced her reaction. Investigators discovered that her animosity towards Stephen went far beyond minor familial grievances. Laurie felt more and more under his control as the years went by. She referred to the mounting conflict as overpowering, citing her sense of powerlessness to uphold her authority in the home and his incessant demands. In her notes, Detective Monroe detailed the incident. Laurie seemed embarrassed, but her tone was tinged with resentment. She appeared to be both burdened by the duty she had assumed for Stephen's care and resentful of his control over her. The investigation's course was altered by this discovery. Investigators started to wonder if Laurie's anger and the disparity in power between her and Stephen could have become violent. Her smooth face suddenly appeared to be a facade, concealing years of shame and despair. The investigation's next target was Stephen's 79-year-old biological grandfather, Dean Brickell. Dean had once been a prosperous businessman, but a string of strokes had left him intellectually and physically weak, with severe memory loss and periods of disorientation. The majority of his days were spent at home, restricted to a recliner in the living room, watching CNN's nightly news or TV reruns of vintage westerns. In the Brickell household, Dean was a remote but innocuous presence to the outer world, although many observed that Laurie appeared to take up the majority of the duties. Neighbors characterized him as quiet and amiable. Laurie was left to deal with Stephen's erratic conduct alone because of his health problems, which had reduced him to the status of a passive observer. Detectives questioned Dean in an attempt to learn more about the dynamics of the household before Stephen's death. They were shocked to learn that he had no knowledge whatsoever of Stephen and Laurie's extramarital affair. The lead interrogator, Detective Carla Monroe, said Dean was cooperative, but perplexed. When we brought up the affair she mentioned in her case file, he actually looked astonished. "That's ridiculous," he said. "Stephen would never be belated by Lori." He appeared wounded, as though he was still coming to terms with a betrayal he had never anticipated. Dean admitted to detectives that he frequently overheard conflicts between Lori and Stephen, but he attributed them to either Stephen's well-known anger management problems or generational misunderstandings. In his interview, Dean claimed that they were constantly at each other's throats. However, I assumed it was just because Stephen disregarded her guidelines. Dean found it difficult to give concise responses when asked if he had observed anything out of the ordinary in Lori's behavior. Due to his health issues and need on others for basic care, he was mainly ignorant of what was taking place under his own roof. Dean's room was on the other side of the home from Stephen's, and investigators pointed out that his deteriorating mobility probably made it hard for him to see or hear conversations that could have sparked suspicion. A dismal image of a man who had lost control of his household was drawn by Dean's ignorance. Despite their early suspicions, detectives were unable to find any evidence that connected him to Stephen's killing. Dean was obviously not involved in the crime, as evidenced by his weak state and sincere surprise when questioned, but his lack of knowledge of the affair exposed the depth of the dysfunction and secrecy that had pervaded the Brickell home. Detectives discovered a startling and tragic twist during the course of the inquiry that changed their perception of what happened before Stephen Brickell died. Following forensic testing that revealed Stephen had been living with HIV, including toxicology and blood work, the information was made public. Because of this evidence, investigators returned to the Brickell home to examine the tense relationship between Stephen and Lori, his step-grandmother. Investigators interviewed Lori's close friends and reviewed her medical records. During these investigations, a somber image surfaced. Lori recently told a friend that she was afraid she might have gotten HIV from Stephen. Shortly before his passing, she had discovered Stephen's diagnosis, which apparently grieved and infuriated her. Already a sinister secret, the affair had taken a turn for the worse. Furthermore, in the weeks preceding his murder, detectives found evidence that suggested Stephen had physically abused Lori. Despite the unusually warm October weather, Lori often wore long sleeves and a lot of makeup, according to neighbor interviews. One neighbor reported noticing bruises on Lori's arms during a casual visit, but Lori denied these decisions when asked. Additionally, investigators discovered text messages from Stephen on Lori's phone that suggested a domineering and erratic relationship. In one especially terrifying conversation, Stephen threatened to tell the family about their affair if Lori didn't pay him money. Although this digital trail supported Lori's allegations of physical and mental abuse, it also complicated her possible motivations. The investigation was reframed by the twist, which told the story of a lady who was pushed to her limit. Dr. Wendy Kwok, a forensic psychologist who was brought in to provide case consultation, wrote in her report that Lori's circumstances were a perfect storm of desperation, fury, and terror. According to Kwok, the setting was ripe for catastrophe because of the physical abuse, the affair's secrecy, and the revelation of Stephen's diagnosis. Instead of clearing Lori, this fresh knowledge increased the suspicions of the detectives. A poisonous connection that might have turned into murder was implied by the affair and the violence that followed. The evidence suggested a planned reaction to a profoundly personal betrayal, even though Lori had presented herself as a victim of circumstance. Detectives began to pay closer attention to Lori's possible involvement in Stephen's death as a result of this twist, which marked a turning point in the case. The intricate and terrifying relationships within the Brickell household were also highlighted. Stephen Brickell's mother, Janice Colton, was also being investigated. Investigators had concerns after she was released from prison a few days prior to Stephen's death. Janice was 36 years old and had been in and out of prisons for much of her adult life. Her lengthy battle with drinking and drug addiction was the cause of her criminal background. Records of her arrests showed a string of possession, theft, and DUI offenses that began in her early 20s. Janice frequently relapsed, despite several stints in rehabilitation facilities, which resulted in several run-ins with the law. Janice was most recently sentenced to prison for a DUI that resulted in a small collision. 5 days prior to Stephen's death, she had been granted parole. She made a quiet return to Milton, Georgia. However, authorities then discovered that she had already communicated with a number of relatives, including Stephen's grandfather, Dean Brickell. A shocking discovery was made by detectives as they examined Janice's activities in the days preceding the murder. Janice and Dean have been having a covert sexual relationship. The relationship was extremely unusual and startling for the family because of Dean's deteriorating health and dementia at the age of 79. Interviews with family acquaintances and intercepted text messages on Janice's phone provided proof of the affair. They remembered strange interactions between the two at previous events, such as unwanted physical contact. Stephen's contribution added much greater significance to this revelation. Stephen had found out about the affair just days before he passed away. Investigators discovered that a neighbor had seen Stephen and Janice get into a furious quarrel. The neighbor claimed that Stephen had confronted his mother, accusing her of using Dean's vulnerability and betraying the family. According to witness reports, Stephen stormed out of the house that night, clearly agitated. Janice was questioned by the police on the affair and how it related to Stephen's passing. At first, she denied the connection and stated that she just visited the Brickell residence to speak with Dean about family issues. Janice, however, broke down and confessed to the affair after being shown the text messages and supporting testimony. Despite their tense relationship, she insisted bitterly that she had nothing to do with her son's murder and that she would never hurt him. Investigators were unable to locate concrete evidence connecting Janice to the murder, despite the fact that her connection with Dean strained family relationships. Nevertheless, as the case progressed, her presence in the home and her tumultuous past with Stephen made her a noteworthy person of interest. One of the most startling elements of the case was Laura Brickell's role in Stephen Brickell's demise. Investigators discovered that Lori killed Stephen the night of his death, employing a shocking and unsettling technique. Lori made the decision to take action late on October 12, 2011. After years of emotional and physical abuse, which finally led to an HIV diagnosis, she had been feeling stuck in her toxic relationship with Stephen. She had had enough of his verbal abuse, his domineering demeanor, and his incessant requests for sex. For other stories, go to nysc-jr.org for more information. After everything she had been through, she finally lost it due to the accumulation of stress over time. Police investigations state that Lori suffocated Stephen in his bed with a plastic dry cleaning bag. In order to prevent him from waking, she stealthily entered his room. She gripped the sack hard as she placed it over his head, choking him until he passed out. Stephen struggled, but he was unable to break free from her hold. Lori wasn't instantly relieved that Stephen was dead. Rather, she felt a mixture of remorse, incredulity, and terror. She had just killed someone, and the consequences of her actions started to weigh heavily. However, she was aware that she needed to hide the crime. Taking a bottle of bleach from the kitchen, Lori used it to thoroughly clean the room, paying particular attention to the area surrounding the bed where Stephen had been murdered. In an attempt to remove all traces of her crime, she wiped off surfaces. She was now emotionally detached, motivated by the need to ensure that the murder would go unreported. Lori pretended that nothing had happened. The next morning, she went about her day as if she were just another caretaker. On the inside, though, she was aware of her actions. Later, the police would learn that Lori had taken great care in removing all traces of the murder, but she had overlooked one crucial detail: her own DNA. Police discovered Lori acting suspiciously during subsequent interrogations. Investigators saw that she exhibited uneasy behavior and gave conflicting replies when questioned. The case seemed suspicious because of the room's bleach odor, the lack of a struggle, and the clear symptoms of suffocation. Detectives used forensic testing to find Lori's hair traces in the room and her fingerprints on the dry cleaning bag. They came to the conclusion that she was responsible for Stephen's murder because of her emotional distance and the tangible proof. Lori did not exhibit any remorse at the time of her arrest. Rather, she had a feeling of relief, liberation from the years of mistreatment. Despite the horror of being discovered, Lori felt as though she had at last taken control of her own life. Laura Brickhill was put on trial in March 2012 for Stephen Brickhill's vicious murder. Police were able to charge her with first-degree murder after weeks of investigation. Local attention was drawn to the situation, especially considering that it included a horrifying crime that appeared quite unimaginable: abuse and a tangled mixture of family secrets. Richard Casalivo, Lori's defense lawyer, attempted to explain that she had acted in self-defense, saying that she was afraid for her life because of Stephen's violent past and his affair with her. Casalovo made an effort to portray Lori as a victim who had been overpowered. This assertion was refuted by the prosecution, which was led by District Attorney Linda Barachowski. They maintained that Lori's actions were premeditated and that she had killed Stephen while he was asleep and then attempted to hide the crime. Forensic results demonstrating that Lori's fingerprints were discovered and the dry cleaning bag used to suffocate Stephen were among the crucial pieces of evidence the prosecution presented. They implied that Lori had gone to considerable measures to conceal the evidence by highlighting the bleach that had been used to clean up the crime scenes. The jury also heard testimony regarding Lori and Stephen's toxic relationship, with friends and family members detailing how Stephen had mistreated Lori on multiple occasions in the months preceding his death. Lori herself took the stand during the trial, which was a traumatic time. She described to the jury the emotional and physical toll her tumultuous relationship with Stephen had inflicted on her. Although she acknowledged killing him, she said she felt helpless and imprisoned. Her story was less credible, though, because of the murder's deliberate nature and her lack of feeling. The jury returned a verdict after several days of deliberation. Lori Brickhill was convicted of first-degree murder. Reactions to the judgment were not quite uniform. Some were indignant that she had taken a life so cruelly, while others sympathized with her as a victim of abuse. Judge Thomas Mitchell gave Lori a life sentence without the possibility of parole during her sentencing hearing. The murder was a planned act of violence, he said, even though it was obvious that Lori had suffered in her relationship with Stephen. Taking another person's life has no justification. Richard Casalovo, Lori's lawyer, said he was disappointed by the result, but respected the court's ruling, according to Judge Mitchell. However, the jury's effort and the careful attention they gave the evidence were commended by District Attorney Linda Barachowski. Laura Brickhill's future was sealed in a prison cell when she was arrested to start her term. Laura Brickhill's life changed drastically after her conviction in March 2012 when she was given a life sentence without the chance of release. Lori was committed to a correctional facility to complete her sentence. The nature of the murder and the intricate links involved in her case horrified many people, and her trial attracted a lot of media interest, particularly in the small village where she had lived. Lori would spend the remainder of her days in prison thinking back on what she had done and the lives she had ruined. Meanwhile, Janice and Dean's lives took a surprising turn. The two eventually got married in 2012, despite their tumultuous past and the strange love triangle that had developed prior to Stephen's passing. Following Stephen's passing, their relationship became more well-known, and many members of the community began chatting about their peculiar connection. As they attempted to re-establish their lives together following the turmoil surrounding their son's passing, some conjectured that Dean and Janice's marriage was an act of atonement. Unfortunately, they didn't stay together for long. Dean died in early 2013 from a major stroke that occurred just months after they were married. Many were stunned by his unexpected passing because he had seemed to be in good health. Although Janice was saddened, her fortitude quickly showed as she turned to her faith for comfort. Following Dean's passing, Janice started going to church more frequently. She became a youth pastor after beginning to help at neighborhood youth programs. It was amazing how she changed. Janice, who was once well known for her battles with drugs and alcohol, developed into a dedicated leader who assisted struggling teens in discovering their way. She took her job seriously, connecting with the young people she worked with through her own challenges in the hopes of helping them avoid the same mistakes she had made as a young woman. Janice's job as a youth pastor became her new purpose, even if her background was still a subject of whispered discussion in her community. She became known for changing her life and helping others in the years that followed. Her tale turned into one of redemption, demonstrating that life could be rebuilt even amid the most difficult circumstances. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share. See you on the next story.